Francesca, I'm very delighted to welcome you to the Ollscoil Uladh. Thank you very much for joining us today. Dr. Francesca Lamorgia is a very well renowned and very well read. I've been doing a little bit of research on you myself. Specialist in bilingualism and multilingualism, and is currently lecturing in jointly with the Froebel Department of Primary and Early Childhood Education in Maynooth University, and also in the Linguistics Division of the Ulster University. So broad breadth of knowledge there, both in linguistics and also in early childhood development of linguistic ability. And today you're going to speak to us about, you know, the development of language and how that affects possibly children with special needs in particular. You're also, Dr. Francesca is also the founder of Mother Tongues, which is a not-for-profit organisation which promotes multilingualism throughout Ireland, and the benefits and, you know, general societal awareness of multilingualism. And since they were founded only in 2017, they've already won many awards. For instance, they have a book out for children, the Language Explorers Activity Book, which is also available in Irish, so I will be sourcing that at Aingeal Nic, and it won the Ministry of Education European Label Award in 2018 from the Republic of Ireland. So I'm sure you're going to give us some fascinating insights today, Francesca, so I'm delighted to welcome you, and I hope you don't mind going ahead there.
Yeah, I will go ahead. Thank you for your introduction. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some slides that introduce you to our work and the importance of multilingualism, and specifically talk about language and language difficulties in the context of immersion education. And then I will take your questions. So I'm going to just share my screen, and you should be able to see my slides. Okay.
Sorry, just before Francesca talks, I wonder, would it be worth asking everybody to go on mute just while Francesca's giving her talk? Is that okay? Just in case there's some background sound. Thanks, folks.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to start off with the description of the kind of activities that we do, so that you're aware of kind of where I'm coming at and where I'm coming from. Also, I'm Italian. I mentioned that earlier when we were having a chat, and I've been living in Ireland for 15 years. So I kind of feel like I'm a bit Irish as well. But that's for another day. So in 2017, I founded Mother Tongues to support schools, families, and all kind of groups who wanted to know more about bilingualism, multilingualism, and also to allow children to experience the languages, whatever those might be, in ways that are natural, and so that the children don't feel that bilingualism or multilingualism is something that is only unique to their own family or their own environment. And so some of the work that we've been doing was with parents who are interested in raising bilingual children or children with additional languages, with teachers, and also more and more now with early years educators who are facing either they face challenges because maybe in their training they don't learn about multilingualism, second language learning, or also because they find that their classes are multilingual and they want to promote multilingualism themselves through teaching techniques. Also, once a year we run a festival, so throughout the year we work with artists who speak different languages, and this is again another opportunity for adults to see the value of multilingualism, but also for children to see that while they're doing drawing in a class with also other Irish speakers next door, they can go over and learn about Chinese or Japanese. And so it's really a celebration of languages on the island of Ireland. So in terms of things that we know, I think I have been doing this for many years, and some of you in the audience will also be very familiar with the concerns that parents have. So parents tend to be concerned about bilingual language development, second language learning, and sometimes specifically to certain languages, sometimes specific to language difficulties and language impairment. And for this reason, we give talks on bilingual language development, and every year we might reach around 1,000 parents through talks that are either in community settings like libraries or within schools. And we also know that teachers want more information and training in the area of bilingualism and second language learning to make the most of the opportunity. And this bilingualism, multilingualism might be widespread, but we always see that the reason why parents struggle is that they find that their children don't have a lot of opportunities to use the language outside the home or outside the school in the case of Irish. And so we are aware that children need a lot of opportunities to use the language, and we want to provide those as much as possible. So we liaise with organizations and with parent groups to see how can we be the catalyst for more opportunities for the usage of the heritage language or the minority language in the community, I suppose. And then we also are aware that society in Ireland and in a lot of English-speaking places places a huge amount of value on the majority language. And also we know that parents who raise their children, for example, parents who are from outside of Ireland and bring their own linguistic heritage, they place also a huge amount of value on English because it's an international language, because it's a language that will potentially give their children an advantage later on in life to get the job that they want. So often we see that even parents who are speakers not only of minority languages but also heritage foreign languages, if you like, they may not themselves value the maintenance of their own language, and so they feed that into the societal belief that with English you're fine, that monolingualism, one language is fine. And we know as researchers that it's more normal to be bilingual than to be monolingual. It's more common, and also it's a huge advantage not only for individuals but also for societies. And so that's why we provide training and opportunities to meet, but also we have our festival, which is our big kind of flagship event that raises this issue at a more national level, I suppose. So within mother tongues, and I think this is a really important point to make at the start, this is my initial belief, my main belief is that you cannot work with children if you haven't got the support of parents and teachers. So everybody has to kind of work together, because what we're doing together is shifting some of the old myths and beliefs and misunderstandings. And sometimes I realize I talk to parents and parents say, yes, but the teacher said something different. Or I work with the children and they say, well, what they are bringing with them is that the parents don't believe in bilingualism. So I think the reason why we work with children, with parents and with teachers, and also I put it under the umbrella of educators, is that you can't just work with one group, because these are so instrumental and the knowledge has to be shared all across. So if children, if we start from the teachers, actually, if the teachers understand that knowing more than one language is an asset, and they encourage bilingualism, multilingualism, they encourage second language learning, they pass that on to the parents, and parents will feel more confident that what they're doing is good, and that will then ultimately benefit the children. And at the same time, the educators will also have the benefits of having the parents as partners in the education of the children. So children sometimes, you know yourselves, sometimes they will love the language, sometimes they will be very negative about it, but a lot of these will be obviously individual, but some of these preconceptions of our language will be fed in from the outside, either from the family or from outside the family. So our work happens at all levels, because we realize that to really value multilingualism, everybody needs to come on board. And we know that in terms of the benefits of immersion education, there is research, and I've mentioned only two papers that you see at the very bottom here that are quite recent. I would be against you saying, oh, if you're bilingual, you're going to have a better life, you're going to be smarter, you're going to have, it's not, it's sometimes these findings are they go into the extreme, but the reality is that there is evidence that if you're immersed in a second language, your memory improves. And this is shown across studies of children, but also adults learning a second language also later on in life. So actually, it's not only the learning of the language, but it's the consistency in the learning of another language that gives you these advantages. And so when we read in the news, sometimes we see if you're bilingual, you don't get dementia. That's not true. You might get it, but what is happening is to the brain is that the brain of a bilingual or of a second language learner does see changes and improvements in some of its operations. And these improvements are only seen when you're regularly using the two languages. So you cannot use a blanket statement and say, if you're bilingual, you're going to be better at this, better at that. The benefits are seen when the languages are used regularly and when there is, for example, switching from one to the other on a regular basis, which obviously implies that you're using all of your languages. So we also know the second point is from the first study by Purich and Vuksanovic, that the daily length of exposure has an impact on the improved executive function. So when we talk about the cognitive benefits of bilingualism, we talk about an increase in attention, an increase in memory, an increase in the ability to focus, in the ability of learning additional languages. And what we see is that if you are exposed to a language more, these areas of cognitive ability are improved. So in this study from 2017, they compared children who were immersed in a language for a longer period of time, so 5 hours a day, versus children who only heard the language 1 hour a day. And they showed that the more exposure children had, the more improved the executive functions is, which obviously provides a case for immersion education. And some of the advantages, you will find that if you ever want to go and read the second study by Arizmendi and others, they really review the pros and the cons of all the studies, and they find that a lot of especially for children, a lot of the cognitive benefits are the same as monolinguals. So actually immersion education is good for children, but in some cases it's not giving them a huge advantage over monolingual children. But one of the findings is that in children, they found advantages in what we call shifting, which is the ability to consciously focus and being able to shift attention from one task to the other, which is what we often talk about, this ability of bilingual children to immediately stop doing something to then start something else. And of course, you can think of many ways in which this cognitive ability is used within the classroom, but also beyond the classroom. In special educational needs, in terms of special educational needs in immersion education, in compared to other areas of bilingualism, we know very little. And the most recent study I can mention is the one by Nick Andrew and O'Dear on the prevalence of special educational needs in Irish medium education in the Republic of Ireland. And what they found is that there has been an increase in the number of children. And also, if you're interested in this study, the report on the prevalence of, how many or what is the percentage of children with special educational needs who might have autism versus maybe specific language impairment or other learning difficulties or dyslexia, for example. And again, they found an increase, and I think this data is really important because there has been for a long time the case, I suppose, maybe it's not it's an unspoken rule that children get taken out of Irish medium education. Therefore, if you go to Irish medium schools, you shouldn't go if you have special educational needs, or if you go, you won't find any children who have special educational needs. And this is changing, and this data is really important, because also if you have the numbers, then you can really do research on it. You can find out how to support them better. So this research is probably the very first important stepping stone to move on from, to move on also in research terms. There are other studies from outside of Ireland, and a lot of studies on special educational needs and immersion education come from the States and Canada. In the case of probably Spanish-English bilingualism, and also French immersion education in Canada. And the first study that by Sylvain Chadron, I hope I'm saying this correctly, is that they interviewed a group of parents who had children in French immersion education, and they found that in some cases where the parents didn't have support, they had to look out for external supports themselves. And these were parents who were really dedicated, and they wanted to have their children educated in French. And also Genesee would also have be a linguist and an educational linguist with a lot of experience, especially in bilingualism and immersion settings in Canada. And what he says is that the research on interventions for immersion students with difficulties argue that at-risk students who are prone to transfer to an English program might remain in immersion if given appropriate intervention. And so the case is not whether it is possible to attend immersion education. Of course it is, and of course children should benefit from all the cognitive and educational benefits that immersion education can give them. But it's more about, is it suitable, and is it going to be a system that will allow children to thrive within the abilities that they have, and how are children going to be supported? So we also know that there's no question whether it is suitable or not suitable in general, but we also know that there is this widespread belief that learning a language is a challenge for children. And I keep going on about this, and I don't understand where exactly it's coming from, because children are, what I think from my personal experience is that adults put themselves in the shoes of children, and they probably think, oh, I had to learn another language in school and it was so tough for me, so my child will struggle. And a lot of people were probably taught with very archaic methodologies. So they might have negative experiences of having learned another language and not having enjoyed it, or having found it more difficult than other subjects like maths, and then suddenly they realize that, oh, maybe this is too difficult for my children. But we know from research, we know from evidence, we see it if you're teachers, you see it in front of your eyes every day. Children do very well at learning languages, and the younger they are, the more interested they are in everything they're learning about. And to learn a language through immersion doesn't even mean learning a language. For the children, it's just natural. It's what they hear, it's how they respond. So it's definitely something that gives them an advantage without any specific major effort. But we have to kind of go across that barrier. We come across that barrier a lot. Also, some parents think that children don't need the extra language, and they question that a lot. And they probably think if children have two languages, it means that they may not know either of them really well. And they might end up thinking, well, we might as well focus on English because that will give this and that and the other advantage, rather than maybe Polish or Irish, because if the child will have two, they will never excel in both. And we know that this is not true. And we also know that things that you learn in one language, you can very easily transfer onto the other. And I'm not going to go into every single benefit, but for me to be able to speak 2 or 3 languages myself, it has been great in all my interactions I've had in my life with friends, with friends of friends, with making connections with people. So having language knowledge is also a social skill. It's not only giving you cognitive benefits, but it's giving you social benefits, and an understanding that there isn't only one way of looking at the word, there isn't only one way of expressing yourself. And so children start to become more tolerant because they understand that there's more than one way of looking at the world. And the last point I have is that if there is lack of awareness that there are so many benefits to second language learning, to immersion, to simultaneous bilingualism, then we'll continue to face these challenges, because I feel that more information needs to be shared, more awareness needs to be available also not only to parents but to teachers and to those who make decisions about education. And so there are lots of ways in which children can become bilingual and multilingual, and I could go on all day about this, but there are some simultaneous bilingual children. So these are the ones that we call, say, 2L1. They have two languages that they develop from very early on, so from first year of life or first couple of years of life. So my own children would be considered simultaneous bilinguals. I've exposed them to Italian and English within our family from the day they were born. Then you have second language learners, who would be the children who develop an additional language after the first, usually after the age of 2, or usually after the first language has been established. And also, to become bilingual, there's many ways. Some children become bilingual because, like in my family, they hear the language spoken from the parents. And in my own family, it's only one parent speaking the language against the world, I suppose. And it's my job, I suppose, to find as many opportunities as possible for them to attend school, to meet other families. With other languages, you might have more structured supports and larger communities. For example, the Polish would have, in a lot of cities and towns around Ireland, they would have schools where children can be immersed in the language for up to 6 hours during the weekend. So you have a mixture of home language maintenance and also immersion education through complementary schools. And then with Irish, you might find that you have families in a school where the parents speak Irish at home, or one of the parents speaks Irish at home. Some families where the Irish has only come in through the education, so the children might have attended Irish medium preschools or primary school. And teachers have usually a very important role in identifying difficulties, because it's true that parents might have had a sense that the child might need more help, but in many cases we find that teachers are the first adult, or a preschool teacher, first adult, who comes across something that they find might be different from the usual linguistic development. And what is really challenging but also interesting is that if you don't know the language that the child is speaking, you will find it very difficult to find out if the child has a difficulty in that language. So it's really important that, as well as teachers, who obviously are speakers of the language, and the parents, people who do the public health screenings and people who are speech and language therapists, occupational therapists, also are familiar with the language, because, and I'll get to this in a minute actually. In terms of identifying difficulties, sometimes the first people to notice might be the teachers, and I think this is really important to raise. And I wanted to just go through what you might find in speech, language and communication of children who may then have special educational needs, or they exhibit difficulties in language and communication. So with speech, you might find that children are not easy to understand. So they might use sounds that are off the standard production of children in that language. And also children who have speech difficulties might have, especially at the start, a limited speech sound inventory, and to the extreme that they may be nonverbal. When it comes to language, so speech has to do with how we articulate our sounds, but language is how we think of what we're saying and how we express it. So how we put together a sentence, for example. So with language, you might find that, yeah, the sounds might be perfect, but the sentence is incorrect in the terms of word order. And this raises questions already if we're talking about Irish, because Irish has different word order to English. and to Italian and to Polish. You know, languages are different. So it is sometimes difficult to identify difficulties, because you might wonder, is this a difficulty associated with second language learning? Or is it a natural second language learning pathway? Or is this a language difficulty that we need to assess, identify, and work on with appropriate speech and language therapy? Some children might take more time than their peers to formulate their sentences or finding words. This is something that we also find in bilingual children. When you are multilingual, it takes you slightly longer to find the right word because you have competitive information. So it doesn't mean that you're slower at speaking, but it might mean that sometimes you have that word in English in your head because you've been using it a lot and you're looking for the word in Irish, and it might take you a couple of seconds. But children who really have struggles with language, you will find that they really have difficulty finding the word, even if it's a high frequency word. So teachers might sometimes find that this is a difficulty that they can spot quite quickly. And in terms of receptive language, so understanding and comprehending language, teachers might notice that the child has difficulty in understanding instructions, for example. And so you might see that this specific child has more difficulty than the other children in the class. But also language is not only speech and sentence structure, but it's got to do also with communicating and with social skills. So you might notice that the child is interacting differently with other children, and it's not because they're shy or because they're taking their time to get to know everybody, but you will find that children who struggle more consistently then also might end up having pragmatic language issues later on. And also what we need to take into account if you're a parent making a decision, or a teacher, is that when learning a second language, children have to acquire fewer meanings. So you already have a word in your mental dictionary on how to say pencil case, and you already have an association between the object and the referent. So all you need is to add another word in the other language. So and in some cases you're quicker at learning new meanings because you've learned how to do it. Also, when you're learning a second language, you are revisiting some aspects of life, social skills that you have already discussed in your other language. So we also know that learning a second language can be extremely good for your self-esteem. And in the case in which children are learning something for the first time, and I can give you a very specific example, which is learning Irish for children who have very limited English when they start school. When those children learn Irish, for the first time, they feel like they're the same as everyone else because they're learning something starting from scratch. So it gives children a very strong sense of self-esteem. And this also applies to children who are learning Irish in an immersion setting. When they're all starting from the same point, they're all on the same boat. So actually what we sometimes feel, oh, my child is going to feel this is hard, it's a very good boost in their self-assessment, in knowing how well they can do in something that is so new to them. So children progress quite well when they're learning a second language. But there's also considerations that we need to bear in mind, that if a child has special educational needs of various kinds, obviously it's very difficult to now in 5 minutes to just give, I can only give you a broad introduction here. But things that we might want to consider is that in the two languages, if you are struggling with language at a level that you would be considered to need additional support, things to bear in mind is that the pronunciation across the two languages is different. So it might take a while to learn new phonological forms, and this applies to all languages, Irish of course. Also, that if you are immersed in a language, you might get a lot of words introduced at once, a lot of new sentence structures introduced at once. And if the child is struggling with memory or with making associations, this might be difficult. So it's something that we need to bear in mind, and to be patient with the child, to give them the time to develop, rather than expecting very quick results at a very steady pace. Also, some children will develop each language more slowly than typically developing peers, especially children who have language-specific difficulties might be found to have a language delay. So you might find that both languages are developed more slowly than typically developing peers. And there is a really important couple of points at the end, and I can send you, if you like, a paper that I wrote about this specifically, about what to compare, how to compare children, or how not to compare children. It's that if you're looking at bilingual children, first of all, they shouldn't be compared to monolingual children. But also, if you're looking at children with special educational needs, you have to bear in mind that they are developing language differently from children who don't have special educational needs. So here, you know, it's something that you really have to bear in mind, because maybe sometimes we benchmark children in a way that isn't, you know, it's not achievable. And then we start to worry about bilingualism, we start to worry about language difficulties. But what we need to do is just not compare bilinguals with monolinguals. And also, we find that children who are bilingual and children who are monolingual, and both groups have special educational needs, they do equally well in school. So we could compare bilingual children in a way with monolingual children with special educational needs, but what it would be really unfair would be comparing a monolingual English-speaking child with a bilingual child with special educational needs, because we're looking at two very, very different types of children. But again, comparison always leads to confusion, I find. So in terms of language disorders, so these are specific to language. We have some more recent terminology that refers to children with developmental language disorder, which used to be called SLI, specific language impairment. So a language disorder refers to children with language difficulties that create obstacles to communication or learning in everyday life, and is associated with poor prognosis. And developmental language disorder is a new terminology, and it refers to children who have these struggles, but these are not connected with any other condition, such as autism spectrum disorder, brain injury, or other genetic conditions such as Down syndrome. So if a child doesn't have any other condition that causes the difficulty in language, they may be assessed for what we call developmental language disorder. And this is called language disorder because, or developmental language disorder, because the child has no other evidence of any other difficulty, and their difficulty is only expressed in the language production and language comprehension. There are some typical errors that children make, but they're also language specific. So you need research in the Irish language to know what kind of typical errors children make. But we find that across languages, children have difficulties with morphology, so producing the correct word ending. And what is difficult in this case is that if I use English as an example, children with developmental language disorder who speak English have problems producing the S at the end of a plural, for example, or the S like she plays, they might say she play. But this is exactly the same error that a second language learner makes when they're learning English for the first time. So we find that, and this is extremely complex, but we find that there are similar errors in second language learners and in children who have developmental language disorder. And this makes it more complicated to disentangle the disorder from the natural process of second language learning. And this is something that I think is really important, but at this point in time, there is a growing amount of research, and also it's growing for the Irish language, but it's obviously, we're still at the very early stages. What we also see with developmental language disorder is that it's invisible. So because children don't show any difficulty, they don't necessarily have impairments that we can observe from a very young age. this might be detected very late in life. For some children, it gets detected after a few years in primary school, for some even in secondary school, because it might be seen as being having sloppy writing or having sloppy grammar, and that can be an issue. But obviously, being developmental, it's something that children have to live with and cope with, and they have to get the appropriate support for it. And also there is, as I said, growing amount of research from outside of Ireland showing that children who have developmental language disorder, so something that is specific to language, can be successful second language learners. And this is really important if you are deciding on immersion education or education in a second language. It is important to know that children can succeed and can have very positive experiences of second language learning if they have a language disorder. So there is no evidence of a disadvantage of children with developmental language disorder, given that they get the support that they would be getting in any other school if they were in immersion English, for example. And the best advice, that is always best clinical practice, and this is not only for Irish immersion, but it's for any bilingual context, is that both languages are supported. And this means through the education system, but also in their therapy that they're accessing. And again, going back to the developmental language disorder, some recent literature suggests that bilingualism can actually be beneficial for children who have language disorder. So it seems that because of this condition, they draw knowledge from the L1 and apply that to the second language. So what bilinguals have in comparison to monolinguals is an earlier awareness of what we call metalinguistic awareness. So awareness of how language works and what techniques you need to transfer knowledge from language A to language B. So by being in a bilingual context where you have to figure it out and negotiate all this on a regular basis, bilingualism seems to be, according to some studies, something that helps children who have developmental language disorder. And so the issues to consider when children speak more than one language is that to successfully learn more than one language, children need sufficient input and opportunities of interaction. So the more, the better, whether it comes from the home. And parents can also play a very important role here. And with Irish, the really common question that I get is, my Irish isn't great, can I still help? And you probably are going to have your own answers that are, I would always say to parents, if you have a little bit of Irish, that's what you have, and that's what you can pass on. And you can also continue to boost your own Irish as time goes on. But it's really important that parents don't feel that if they have a bit of Irish, that should stop them from using it. Actually, that should be the starting point for developing it, rather than feeling bad about how little they have. And for parents, especially in the case of language impairment or any other kind of special educational need, is that it's important that if you have a home language, whatever that might be, that you continue to keep it up. And so if you have 2 or 3 languages spoken in your home, the fact that your child has learning difficulties shouldn't stop the maintenance of the home language. Also because in a lot of cases, parents maintain their home language also because it gives them a sense of connection to the extended family. So by excluding the child to that, you're triggering another set of problems that are not required. And also, it's important that as much as possible, speech and language therapy and assessment should be available in each of the child's languages. And I'm aware that this may not always be possible, but it is a right. So it's every child's right to be assessed in the language that they know best. And especially in the case of minority languages, I know that this is an extremely hot topic because it is challenging to receive therapy and also assessment in a minority language. And also for the parents to remember that bilingualism is not the cause of language difficulties. So not to feel that the parent is guilty for having spoken a different language to the child in comparison to the mainstream language. So I'm gonna leave you with some issues to consider. So how do we have the skills to identify children with special educational needs? And what's really important is that in order for immersion education of children with additional needs to succeed, is that we're able to identify the children and to support them and their parents by giving the appropriate services. And also there are questions about the health service and how can they work with the school to provide the support in the best possible way that retains the children in an environment where they have the potential to thrive. And also in terms of teaching, we know that of course teachers are instrumental in not only in supporting the children but also in educating the parents and making them aware that immersion education is beneficial. And so is training for teachers available? And also finally, what is the kind of support, practical support, but also knowledge that is needed for schools to help children succeed and stay in the system? So I'm going to leave it to you to ask any questions you might have, and if we don't have time to answer your questions, if you have more, you can email me, and my email is francesca@mothertongues.ie. But thank you for having me as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my slides so I can see you.
Thank you very much, Francesca. That was really interesting. Thank you very much for sharing that. I agree totally there that bilingualism and teaching children other languages does help build their self-esteem, as you had mentioned. And I know from my own experience of teaching for 20 years that I often think people underestimate children who have additional needs, and they assume, oh no, like particularly when I started as a younger teacher, it would have been more common for so-called experts, you know, maybe speech and language therapists or educational psychologists from outside the system to come into an Irish medium school and say, oh, to the parents, oh, well, you know, obviously you'll have to move them to English medium because, you know, they're experiencing difficulties learning, so, you know, can't be adding to their burden by putting them through Irish medium as well. But I've often found that children who have needs still do very well within a second language, even if they don't have that language at home. You know, it's another string to their bow, and it goes on to add to their confidence levels, you know, when they go on to secondary schools, etc. But first of all, I just wanted to say thank you very much for that. And also I wanted to just ask quickly, would you feel it's the same experience when you're working then with other families in other languages across Ireland, not just our own experience in Irish medium, that we're going, oh, sometimes the system is against us a bit, but it is a general thing for other speakers of other languages to find that they have difficulties sometimes dealing with services, say the health service, etc.
Yeah, and what we know is that parents, and I'm giving you the example, say an Italian parent who lives in a city in Dublin, say, and parents of bilingual children very often haven't been raised bilingual themselves. So immediately they're concerned and they go straight in and they see, you know, I hear parents getting their children assessed as something like trying to get the children assessed as 9 months because the child isn't speaking, or they've said a word that sounds like Italian but also sounds like English. And then, you know, when it comes to school, the only difference is that the parents don't have a choice if they want to send them to English medium schools. They don't have a choice because that's the mainstream education. So they have to have their children educated through English. But what they are often told is stop speaking Italian. So this is happening still, and it's been happening for years, because I have friends who have teenagers, and I remember the very first chat I had with those friends was, oh, Francesca, what do you think? I was told to stop speaking Italian. So what I think there is, and this is not an Irish language issue, this is a general language issue, that there is this belief that, oh, well, if you take this language away, at least the child has to struggle with just one language or boost only one language, without really realizing that the two languages are helping each other. They're not fighting against each other. So
yeah, exactly. I think very much, as you say, we are underestimating our pupils who have, you know, additional needs when we sort of think that they can't handle both languages, because I've often found that even children with severe academic difficulties can chatter away fluently in Irish, you know, and it's something that they feel, now maybe their writing of it, their written production of the language wouldn't be as good, but they can chat, you know, and they're very happy to do that and proud of that fact. Now I'll stop talking. Perhaps Martina and Sinead there would maybe like to ask a question. Can you hear us, folks?
No, I'm just happy to listen.
So,
very refreshing.
Yeah. Martina, as you would have a lot of experience with the early years too, and I know we would all sometimes have an inkling sometimes with, oh, as a child having difficulties, but we have to be careful too, Francesca, as you were saying, not to jump too quickly to judge, because particularly in an immersive or a second language environment, sometimes it can just take a little bit more time for children to develop the transferable skills.
Yeah, and what I think is the closest to Irish immersion, where if you're saying the children are coming from homes where they only speak English, so they're thrown into a class where, look, you know, we of course we speak also English, but let's immerse ourselves and let's try our best, and the more Irish we have at the start, the better. The closest to this is the English children who have English as an additional language, who might come from, say, Poland, and they go into school with the difference that the teachers don't speak Polish, so the child has no choice to be understood. But those children would spend quite a lot of time trying to figure out what's going on, try to listen, and you hear from teachers that some children would be very quiet or say very, very little for the first few months. And so in an immersion setting, you can expect that there will be some children who will do exactly the same, because they're totally immersed with something that is new to them, and they have to figure it all out. So in a way, maybe you have a mixture of English to support them, while in the EAL case it's not possible because the teachers usually don't speak Urdu and Chinese and Japanese. But I find that that's the closest concept. And even when teachers, sometimes my own students would say, well, we are going to teach the Irish class through Irish, but of course, if children don't understand, we have to use English. And I always say, hold on, but what if you just use Irish? And what's going to happen? Because children learn to understand how to understand. And they learn to cope with, okay, I haven't understood this, but so I have to turn on my active brain and find a solution to this problem. And this is what gives them really a huge advantage. But also in relation to what I said earlier, the thing is, in some cases, you might be able to access, rare cases, therapy in Irish to some extent, or you might be told, okay, you can do exercises in Irish. But for other languages, this is not possible at all. So actually, the reason why in a lot of cases, parents are told to do therapy, for example, in their own language to support the child, in English, is that there is no therapist who speaks a foreign language. Like, it's really rare to find therapists who speak foreign languages, and all therapists are Irish, because if you're not Irish, it's really difficult to access the profession. Same for primary school teaching. There's no non-Irish primary school teachers. Like, they'd be quite difficult to find. So you have teachers who are not multilingual themselves. Obviously, the Irish medium is different, but in the English medium case, teachers are not multilingual. They may have learned a second language in university, maybe, but it's a very different experience to what the children are going through when they're immersed, because the children are learning so naturally. So that's why I feel that there's more training needed and more awareness needed.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think that you know, as you're saying, the therapists and the different help that you would access, they are becoming, certainly in the Irish medium environment, they're becoming more and more sympathetic nowadays than when I was a young teacher, you know, possibly due to equality laws, etc. But just the Irish medium is a growing sector, and they're becoming more aware of the benefits of it, and they see that maybe in past years where their immediate reaction would have been to say to a parent, oh, I think you should move the child to English medium, they've seen that, you know, quite often parents went, no, I've made the decision, my child's in Irish medium, they're happy here, they're going to stay there. And as that child grew up, they've realised, actually no, you know, the child might have had dyslexia, for instance, but they went on to achieve very well, and the second language didn't hold them back at all, you know. So it is just a case of, I suppose, research and time that we develop more.
You see, with the exemption from Irish, you like, the message is very clear. It's like, oh, you have a tiny little bit of difficulty with reading and writing, then you can be exempt from Irish. Like, the message is kind of really, first of all, it's not funded on any kind of research or any evidence whatsoever, but because no one knows exactly where this idea came from, like why people are exempt from Irish if they have dyslexia, for example. So there is no research evidence to show that there is issues if you keep studying Irish, okay? Or that there's issue that you cannot cope with. You know, there's obviously, maybe you need to take measures put measures in place as you do with the other languages, but it doesn't mean that you have to completely stop with Irish, because what you're taking away is also a potential possibility for the future for the child. But for a long time, this was given as a very simple solution. Okay, so I'm going to apply for exemption from Irish because I've got this and that difficulty. But the message coming from above is like, oh yeah, if you're struggling, then forget about the language. So, you know, but people who have difficulty with numbers don't get exemption from doing maths and geometry and all those kind of other subjects. So there's a bias towards this difficult thing that language is, which doesn't take into account all the really good things that language brings.
Yeah. Sinead, would you like to jump in and ask a question?
No, just
no. Yeah, just listening in.
But I've got a pre-verbal child. I'm just starting on my own journey learning Irish, but he's actually picked up some words.
Very good.
Speak English. He's 7, but he's quite happily sat there singing the wheels on the bus in switching languages. So
excellent.
I've no idea where it came from, but he's so much more confident. So we've been starting to think, should we do this? Should we not? And I think the question's been answered for me. Yes, he's going to start learning.
Yeah, and I have to say that I feel it's always very important that, you know, one of the things about, I think as Francesca spoke, sometimes people have this idea from their own experience of learning a language. You know, for most of us, it was at secondary school. By the stage that we started to learn languages, we were maybe already kind of, you know, 13 or so, and you're embarrassed about anything new, and you just, oh my God, putting on an accent, this is embarrassing in front of all these strangers that you've just started a new big school with. And, you know, people carry that experience into their adulthood and think, oh, learning a language, it's not that good of a thing, and they don't promote it. But it's an entirely different thing for younger children. They have so much more enthusiasm for it, and I do feel that in Irish medium, and Martina could affirm that in the early years, it's a very active experience. You know, we incorporate a lot of singing, a lot of drama. You know, every teacher is acting out and everything, and being over enthusiastic to try and get across their meanings through actions, etc. You know, and I think children do pick up on all those different cues if you give them the chance. And as you're saying, your son's singing away to the wheels on the bus. Music is a great additional factor to help children with other languages, you know.
And when the children have the additional needs, you know, it's not that they're going to do better if they go into a different school. It's just that if the teachers know that they have this additional need, they can support them, whether it's through Irish or through another language. So it's more about, again, awareness and being able to identify the difficulties so that you know, okay, well, the child needs to be working more on the grammar errors, and they might continue to make those errors because there is an issue there. So we're going to focus more on not sticking, you know, not getting too bogged down on this grammatical error, but just maybe working more on communication and social interaction and language in a more oral language as suppose, and supporting the child maybe individually on the writing and getting the knowledge that teachers are not meant to have. Do you know what I mean? Teachers are not speech and language therapists. They're not occupational therapists, and they shouldn't be expected to do all the work. But just to be aware of maybe a couple of tips from a local speech and language therapist on how to support children who have developmental language disorder, for example. And those tips can be applied to any language.
Yeah, absolutely. Francesca, thank you very much for all that. Sinead or Martina, would you like to ask or contribute anything else there? No?
Thank you.
No, just it was very good. So
Yeah.
that's why I sent my children to Irish education.
Certainly benefited them, hasn't it, Martina?
Yes, yeah. We're very confident and creative, and that's all I wanted. Yeah.
Absolutely, they're a credit to yourself, yeah. But again, thank you so much, Francesca, for taking your time to speak to the summer school this weekend, and for sharing your wisdom and your knowledge. And it's lovely to hear, you know, your perspective as a multilingualist yourself, and as someone who's, you know, dealing in the world of multilingualism and with lots of different nationalities, and sharing that wisdom with us, you know, because sometimes even although, you know, people in Irish medium, it's a small enough world too, so it's always good to look outside of ourselves and gain the experience of other you know, education systems from across as you were talking about your research, that you'd looked into Canada and America and other bilingual schools across the world as well in their research. So thank you so much.